Hello children, today we shall start with the second part of the chapter, electrolysis. In the previous part, we saw what are electrolytes, strong electrolytes and weak electrolytes. So, electrolytes are any of the acids, bases or salts which are capable of ionizing. We also saw non-electrolytes, they are compounds which do not ionize. Then we saw electrodes which are so important for electrolysis. They could be cathodes or anodes. They may be inert or active. So the reactive electrodes are the ones which take part in the chemical reaction of electrolysis, and the non-reactive inert or the non-attackable electrodes like platinum and carbon which do not take part in the electrochemical reactions. Then we saw the process of electrolysis. Today we shall see process of electrolysis and its applications. Before that, we need to see what is selective discharge of ions. At times in an electrolyte, when electrolysis is going on, when ions separate, we may have more than one type of a cation or more than one type of anion. In that case, which cation will get preference to discharge at the cathode, or which anion will be preferred to be discharged at the anode? That depends upon this series. Let's see this series carefully. From sodium to silver, as we go down the metal in the metallic series, as the activity starts decreasing, as the metallic reactivity decreases, its tendency to form a cation and get discharged at the cathode increases. Similarly, the tendency for anions to discharge increases in the given order, that is from fluorine to sulfate to nitrates to the other halogens to hydroxyl ions. So, what does this mean? Now, when we are talking of the cations, if there is a sodium ion, there is an aluminium ion and there is a copper ion. If three ions are present in the electrolyte, copper being lowest in the reactivity series will get deposited at the cathode. So the element that has lower reactivity, that is lower in the reactivity series, has a higher chance to be discharged at the cathode. Whereas the anion which has lower in this series here, that is hydroxyl ions, has the maximum number of chance of getting deposited or of getting discharged at the anode. So we see that if there are chloride ions and hydroxyl ions, the hydroxyl ions will be discharged at the anode. Now, do hydroxyl ions just discharge as hydroxyl or OH ions? No, they undergo a chemical reaction where two hydroxyl ions can combine together to form a water molecule, and oxygen is given out. Now the first one is electrolysis of lead bromide. As already seen in our first part, when lead bromide has to undergo electrolysis, it has to be in a molten state. We had also seen it for sodium chloride. So lead bromide has to be in a molten state. Only when it is in molten state can it separate into cations and anions. So in this case, it separates into positively charged lead ions, and it also separates into negatively charged bromide ions. It separates into negatively charged bromide ions. So bromide ions are moving towards the anode and positive lead ions move towards the cathode. So it is cations to the cathode, anions to the anode. The same thing we see here, Pb2 plus gets attracted to the cathode. So positive ions get attracted to the negative electrode and the negative ions get attracted to the positive electrode. Let us see the electrolytic reaction for this. So what we see here, at anode, bromine gas is discharged. Bromine ions, they lose electrons to form bromine molecules, and bromine gas is released at anode. So we see here that bromine gas is released. At cathode, lead ions accept electrons. At cathode, we see that lead ions, they accept electrons and form lead metal. So this is how lead metal gets deposited. Metal gets deposited at the cathode. So in any electrolysis reaction, we always see that metals get deposited at cathode. Now let's see the next reaction, that is electrolysis of water. The apparatus that we see here is a Hofmann's voltmeter. It's an H-shaped apparatus. It is a H-shaped apparatus. That's called the Hofmann voltmeter. In this we have platinum electrodes. So here we see at anode also we have platinum electrode, and at the cathode also we have the platinum electrode. This portion of the apparatus that is connected to the anode is called the anodic limb, and the limb of the apparatus that is connected to the cathode is called as the cathodic limb. So in the anode we see that we have oxygen gas. In anode, oxygen gas is collected, whereas in cathode there is hydrogen gas that is collected. If you see the amount of hydrogen gas, it is double. The hydrogen gas is double as that of the oxygen gas. This is because of the reaction that takes place. So suppose we have to do it in a lab. Will we have this kind of voltmeter? No. So we can use beakers and test tubes and have electrolysis of water done even in a lab. So water with little bit of sulfuric acid, which a few drops of that which acts as a catalyst, can be added here and electrolysis will start. What happens with sulfuric acid? Sulfuric acid has a high dissociation, so will dissociate and help water molecules to undergo dissociation, and then the separation of water into hydrogen and oxygen will start. Let's see the electrochemical reactions for this. At anode we get oxygen gas. What happens is two hydroxyl ions form one water molecule and half molecule of oxygen. This equation can also be multiplied by 2 to write 4OH, giving you 2 water molecules and 1 oxygen molecules plus 4 electrons. At cathode we have 2 water molecules accepting electrons to form hydrogen ions and 2 OH ions. So the overall reaction is written as water splitting up into hydrogen and oxygen. So this is how we see that if whatever amount of hydrogen is prepared in one of the limb, oxygen is half of that. Why oxygen is half of the amount of hydrogen that is produced? Because in this reaction, a lot of OH forms water and more hydrogen is generated, whereas oxygen is just half of that of hydrogen that is produced. Now let's see the application of electrolysis. So what are the applications of electrolysis that we have come across? I'm sure the first one could be electroplating of metals. We must have heard of silver plating or gold plating of maybe jewelry or any equipment. So just as electroplating of metals is there, electrolysis is also used in extraction of metals firstly, and also electro refining or purification of metals. So some metals which are very reactive, which do not separate from oxygen, or their chlorides can be separated by the process of electrolysis. So it's used in extraction of metals, of those active metals. It is used for electro refining of metals. So if you want high quality, high grade pure metal, in that case also we use electrolysis process. And definitely we use it for electroplating of metals like galvanization of iron, silver plating, gold plating, etc. Let's see electroplating with silver. Now imagine you want to electroplate a spoon with silver. It's a steel spoon or any other spoon, but you want to electroplate it with silver. So in that case we have to take anode as pure silver metal. The electrolyte here, they have shown a blue color solution, should contain any of the electrolyte which contains silver. What is the process that will happen? From anode, the metal will lose electrons and form an ion. It will lose electrons and it will form a cation. This cation will get into the electrolyte. Because we are passing current through this, electrolyte starts separating into the positive ion and the negative ion. So this electrolyte, which will contain silver, will give out silver ions. This silver ions will move towards the cathode. So now what happens to the silver ion that has come from the anode? It will combine with the electrolyte. It will combine with the electrolyte. So the electrolyte, if you're seeing one molecule of electrolyte, it dissociates. Its cation goes to the cathode. But at the same time, it is receiving a cation from the anode. From the anode material, it receives a cation. And this is how the electrolyte in the process of electrolysis remains constant, whereas the anode keeps on decreasing. So what is the process happening? Again, from anode, the metal will lose electrons, it will form a cation and get into the electrolyte. The electrolyte will split up into cation and anion. The cation will move and go and deposit on the cathode, that is the negative terminal. When the electrolyte is in ionic state, it will get or it will attract the cation that has come from the anode and form the electrolyte again. So electrolyte remains constant, anode decreases, and there is a build up on the cathode. That is, now in this case, if we have taken the spoon, slowly by slowly, it will get covered up with a layer of pure silver ions, and thus it will get electroplated. The reaction for this can be shown as, now in case of a silver plating, we can use maybe silver nitrate, but over silver nitrate also the effective electrolyte is sodium silver cyanide or sodium argentocyanide. This is the preferred electrolyte because it gives more smooth and even plating. So here, though we have sodium ions and silver ions being lower in the reactivity series will get discharged to the cathode. So at cathode what happens? Silver ions, they accept electrons and form silver metal. They get deposited there. And what's happening at cathode? The silver metal loses electrons and forms silver ions. Where do these ions from the anode go? They go to the electrolyte. And then again they get separated from the electrolyte and go and deposit in the cathode. So it's a continuous process where the electrolyte remains as it is and the anode is decreasing, whereas there is a build up on the cathode. Now let's see another process, that is electroplating with silver. The technique is the same here. So any substance that has to be electroplated has to be kept on the cathode. So let's imagine we want to electroplate a spoon with nickel. So here the electrolyte will have to be nickel sulfate. So as we discussed earlier, it has to contain that element that has to be deposited. The electrolyte should contain an element that has to be deposited on the cathode. And again, the anode has to be made up of pure nickel. So anode is made up of pure nickel. It loses electrons. And the cation, after losing electron, that metal will form a cation. This cation enters the electrolyte. Electrolyte has split up into nickel and sulfate ion. So what happens is nickel ion will go and get deposited on the cathode. And at the same time, the nickel ion which has come away from the anode, which has come out of the anode, will get attached with the sulfate ions, forming nickel sulfate again. So the amount of electrolyte in the electrolytic cell will remain constant. Anode will keep on decreasing, reducing, whereas cathode will have a slow build-up of nickel. So slowly by slowly and evenly, the entire spoon or whichever object we keep over there will get electroplated with nickel. Let's see the reactions for this. So we see that at anode, nickel loses electrons and form nickel ion, and at cathode it takes in electrons and forms nickel metal. So nickel gets deposited on the cathode. The next use of electrolysis is purification, that is refining of metal. So if you want to refine a metal, again the metal to be refined has to be kept on the anode. Now this is the metal that has to be refined, and we will get a pure metal on cathode. So you start with a copper rod on cathode, and you take the anode which is impure copper, and you will have to have a solution. The electrolyte in this case has to be copper sulfate, because when we are talking of copper electrodes, both the electrodes are copper. The pure copper, you are going to get it on the cathode. The impure metal will be on the anode. So you start with the impure anode, that is copper rod. Impure copper rod is taken to the anode side, and we have a pure rod of copper on which there will be further buildup of copper. So what happens is, same thing, copper sulfate will split up into copper and sulfate ions. From the anode, copper ions will get deposited onto the cathode via the electrolyte of copper sulfate. So copper sulfate will remain as it is, okay, and we will have pure copper getting deposited on the cathode. So the same procedure, anode loses electrons, forms copper ions. Copper ions get combined with sulfate ions into copper sulfate solution. As the electrolysis process is still on, copper from the electrolyte will go and get deposited on the cathode. So electrolyte splitting, cations moving to cathode, slowly by slowly pure copper will be deposited on the cathode rod. And because we have started with the impure copper material or copper rod on anode side, we will see a lot of impurity or anode mud found below the anode in the electrolytic cells. So that brown picture there, brown part on that image is the impurities of the anode mud. So what is the reaction that is taking place? We have two electrons that are there. For cathode, that is copper ions also are there and hydrogen ions are also there. And at anode side we have sulfate ions as well as hydroxyl ions. Now between copper and hydrogen, we know copper is lower in reactivity series. So copper gets deposited on the cathode. So because it's an aqueous solution, copper sulfate is an aqueous solution. So there is presence of H plus and OH minus ions also. But in this case, the H plus ions have no discharge happening at the cathode. Why? Because copper is lower in the activity series. And between sulfate ions and hydroxyl ions, it is the hydroxyl ions which get discharged, which get preferred. And hence hydroxyl ions, that means from hydroxyl ions you get oxygen gas which is given out. Hydroxyl ion, 4 of them will combine to give you 2 water molecules and oxygen gas. So oxygen gas is given out at anode, and at cathode pure copper sulfate will be deposited. So let's summarize what we have done today. So we have seen electrolysis of lead bromide. It has to be in a molten state, you have to remember that. Then we have electrolysis of water. We have used platinum electrodes. It's a Hofmann's voltmeter. What's important to remember is cathodic limb consists of hydrogen gas, and anodic limb consists of oxygen gas. And oxygen gas is half of that of the hydrogen gas. Then we have electroplating with nickel, electroplating with silver, purification of copper. So these are the topics that we have covered in this chapter.